Welcome to Skinner and Chalmers' Weekly Roast. Today, Yip-Yip-Whoop-Whoop and the case of the curious Corks, a Chalmers journey.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Skinner and Chalmers' Weekly Roast, a podcast where only the steamiest topics are discussed. It is a wonderful Monday afternoon, and I'm Superintendent Chalmers, and as always, by my side is my good old friend, Principal Seymour Skinner. Welcome, Seymour.
Classy welcoming, I see. Well, in that case, hey there, Chalmers, and hey there, our dear listeners. I hope you had a nice day so far.
I hope so, too. A wonderful summer. Great weather for swimming or traveling.
You hit the nail on the head again, Chalmers, because today's topic is your journey within your 6-month sabbatical year around 3 years ago. That reminds me when we hadn't seen each other for a while because of your vacation. I kept forgetting your name the day you came back home.
Oh yes, that day you were really off your game. I remember it too well. I had just gotten off the plane in Memmerfield, rang your doorbell, and you opened the door and said, Oh, hello, Mr. Gerald, right? A moment, Mr. Gerald. Now, who was it?
Yeah, that was quite an awkward situation. I don't know what was wrong with me that day, but for some reason, I thought your name was Gerald, or wait, wasn't Skinner in the mix too?
Exactly. When in doubt, just use your own last name. Very clever, Skinner.
Hey, everyone has their moments. Remember that school trip where you couldn't find your way back to the hotel? Then who had to come get you? Right, me?
Touch, Skinner, touch. Nonetheless, we've known each other for over 20 years, and you still forgot my name. I must admit I was a bit disappointed, but it was entertaining to watch the sweat beads form on your forehead.
I admit, it was a rather embarrassing moment. But come on, we had a good laugh about it afterward, Gerald.
Very funny, Skinner. But yes, it was a wonderful reunion after being away for 6 months.
That reminds me, why don't you tell our listeners about your travels? Where did you go? Why were you away? I'm sure everyone's dying to know.
I'd love to. So I took a 6-month sabbatical to explore the regions around Memmerfield extensively. Plus, I traveled to France to visit the vineyards. You know which ones I'm talking about.
Oh yes, there's only one answer. The region where our favorite wine, Yip-Whoop-Whoop-Whoop wine, is made?
Exactly, Skinner. I wanted to meet the winemakers behind that exquisite beverage, and I highly recommend everyone to visit. The best part was tasting the Yip-Yip-Whoop-Whoop wine at the end. A true delicacy.
Too bad I couldn't join you. But as a couple, sometimes you have to have separate adventures.
True. Having enough freedom and space to have individual experiences is crucial. Still, it would have been nice if you could have come, but your leave request wasn't approved. There was simply no replacement for the best school principal in the area. Isaiah.
Oh, yes. Principal Wiggum was too busy himself. You can't expect him to manage 2 schools at once, and there wasn't anyone else, really. But never mind, what else did you see on your trip?
Right? There were so many wonderful places to discover on that trip. It's hard to pick where to start. Yes, maybe that's a bit trivial, but traveling with the train...
Train travel. Of all the possibilities, I have to admit, I didn't expect that this is one of your highlights.
I know, it sounds simple, but yes, traveling with the train was quite enjoyable. Just looking out the window, watching the beautiful landscapes go by while the sun warms your back. It can be so simple sometimes.
You're right. It has its charm, especially since our region is quite mountainous. When you leave Memmerfield by train, you see mountains on both sides.
That's true. We've hiked those mountains often enough with Krakatoa, but enjoying that scenery from a seat is also wonderful, even if you can't examine the sandstone and limestone up close from the train.
Oh, Chalmers, you and your rocks. Not even on the podcast can I escape your geological escapades.
That's right, Skinner. My rocks are dear to me, though I had to move my collection to another room because Krakatoa keeps nibbling on them.
That's our Krakatoa, a true connoisseur of rocks.
Indeed. After the mountains, there's a flat, grassy plain, a vast open view with a mixed forest on the horizon. Bathed.
Very poetically described, I must say. Unfortunately, it takes about 4 hours to walk there, so we usually drive part way before hiking with our home zoo.
What do you mean by car? We always have to borrow the transporter from Master Chief for our outings. There's no way we could fit all the pets into a car.
Let's be honest. It's not just you and me on these trips. Shadow and Sonic always tag along too. We can't handle that many leashes at once. Sometimes we even have to call Echo to join us. We'd never manage all the pets otherwise.
That's why we only do these big trips with the pets every few months. Otherwise, we just take evening walks around Memafield. Luckily, we have a large garden, so we don't have to take the pets out every day. They can run around together in the garden.
Oh yes, there's nothing better than sitting outside after work and watching our furry or not so furry friends play in the garden. Whether it's Mr. Jellybeans challenging our pondfish, Mr. Big Mouth, to a race, or Cumulus studying cloud shapes with Nadina. It's just wonderful.
Absolutely. And you know what makes it even better?
You mean when your pet alligator Gizmo escapes through the hedge, wreaking havoc on Sonic's edge, and we can't stop laughing?
Well, that too. But I was actually thinking of a glass of the finest Yip-Whoop-Whoop-Whoop wine.
I should have guessed. That makes the evening truly perfect. Even Cosmo would go crazy with joy. Literally, if he could taste that stuff.
True thing. But before we get carried away, what I wanted to say is, thanks to the garden, we have more flexibility and can skip evening walks if needed. Sometimes after a long day, you just don't feel like going out again with the whole herd.
Indeed, and with the exercise they get in the garden, we don't feel guilty about it. Since we added the rock pile in the garden, it's been even better for some of our animal friends.
Ah, yes. The rock pile is perfect for Mr. Guy Gecko and Mrs. Trans Gecko. They bask there for hours enjoying the sun. Cumulus provides the necessary cooling and moisture. Meanwhile, Krakatoa nibbles on the rocks, leaving only gravel crumbs behind.
Oh, yeah. It's so lovely. Thinking about it, what would we do without our pets?
Our lives would be dull and lonely. They are simply part of the family. The only thing that's a bit tedious is cleaning the transporter we borrow from Chief for our trips. Master Chief is very particular about it being spotless. He wants it to look clean in case he has to go on a mission, probably for reputational reasons or something.
Oh, yes. Very meticulous, but understandable. He's kind enough to lend us his transporter, so we don't want to return it dirty.
Right. And of course, we have old Bartholomew who eagerly cleans it afterward. Saves us some work, too.
Oh, yeah, it's real bone work.
Yeah, that was a good one. All right, we've totally drifted off from our original topic. Where was it again, Mr. Was it? Skyner, was it?
Yeah, Gerald. Or was it Mr. Climmers?
Of course not. It's Chalmers. But yes, the trip was our topic. Well, there I was around 7 p.m. at Mehmetapaya Central Station on my way to France. I was waiting for my flight, and as I sat there, I had time to think about life, what I've accomplished, where I'm heading, what still awaits me, and so on.
A real deep conversation with yourself, I bet.
Oh, yes, it took a while for the flight to arrive, and I used that time. It's important to ponder the meaning of meaning every now and then. It grounds you in a way. Of course, you shouldn't overthink for too long, or you might go crazy. But contemplating your life from time to time has its merit.
And what profound revelation did you come to?
I realize I'm incredibly thankful for everything we have. I'm grateful for you, our wonderful pet, this house, my job, and all our amazing neighbors and listeners.
Oh, that's heartwarming. I'm just as thankful and wouldn't trade my life for anything in the world.
Not even for a lifetime supply of non-alcoholic Yip-Whoop-Whoop wine.
Not even that, Chalmers. Not even that.
Well, after my little session of introspection, it was time to move on. The flight to France was nothing special, just economy class and waiting until we arrived.
You sure do some crazy things. I'm not a big fan of flying.
It doesn't bother me at all. I know you're not a huge fan, and if you do fly, it's usually only if Echo or Chief is piloting.
Exactly. I trust their flying skills and feel safe with them. I'm a bit uneasy with strangers at the controls.
I understand your fear, Seymour. Although pilots train for years, and in almost all cases, everything goes smoothly. You only hear about the flights where something goes wrong, or in the worst case, a crash. You never hear about all the successful flights.
Sometimes the smallest rooster crows the loudest.
Indeed, you hear little about positive stories. News tends to focus on negative events because that's what interests people more.
On one hand, yes. On the other, not everything that happens in the world is positive. But yeah, I'd also love to see more positive news.
Maybe it'll come. For instance, the local news could report on your famous lasagna.
Oh yes, the world could learn a lot about my culinary skills.
Although, when I think about it, the house usually ends up on fire, so maybe it's not that positive after all.
Not necessarily, but it always turns out okay in the end.
Yes, thanks to your god. True, maybe.
Speaking of the God Cube, remember that time it malfunctioned and transported us to that parallel universe? You know, the one Cosmo warned us about.
Oh yes, the one where our pets were the humans and we were their pets.
No, the other one where we met a strange person called Old Chalmers. But yes, now that you mention it, Mr. Jellybeans was the mayor of Memmerfield, and we had to attend council meetings.
And Cumulus was a weather reporter, always predicting the perfect cloud shapes for the day.
That was hilarious. And let's not forget Krakatoa, who ran the local bakery making stone cakes.
At least those cakes were rock solid. Literally.
Yeah, I think I still have a chipped tooth from that.
Good times. But speaking of parallel universes, do you ever wonder what our lives would be like if we didn't have all these pets?
Honestly, I can't imagine it. They bring so much joy and chaos into our lives.
Exactly. Life would be so dull without the daily adventures they bring. Cheers to that, and to many more chaotic and wonderful years together.
Absolutely. Here's to us, Chalmers.
To us, Skinner, after this delicious sip of Yip-Yip-Whoop-Whoop wine, we can now move on. That reminds me, we all have our little packages to carry. You have a fear of flying, and I have another, actually quite stupid fear.
Are you sure you want to talk about it in the podcast?
Sure, it's not a bad thing to have fears. You don't choose them either. Anxiety disorders are not uncommon. In fact, they are quite common. And on the contrary, I think it's great when you realize that you might have something like this and can talk about it openly. Of course, that doesn't mean you have to tell everyone out there what kind of anxiety disorder you have. Some people really don't need to know. But in a close circle, it's a powerful thing to admit.
That's right. It takes strength of character.
Anyway, I have this strange fear that I might be on the wrong train, plane or bus, even though all the indications are that this can't be the case. I mean, you can read it on the control panels, even see it in apps. But yes, I'm totally tense and feel uneasy until the vehicle starts, and I realize that it's going in the right direction.
Where does that come from, I wonder? But yes, just because something is rational doesn't take away the fear. We are human beings. We have emotions, desires, but also fears. We can't always explain everything rationally, especially not fears. I mean, many people are afraid of spiders. Most spiders can't harm us, yet many people don't like them. And even if your app says you should be on the right vehicle, your fear is turning your head and making you feel insecure.
I guess you could say that. But yes, it's not that bad, but it's still a bit of an annoying burden. But let's not get hung up on it. You shouldn't let your fears get the better of you. Once I knew that everything was right, I went to France. And, well, after I left Memmerfield, my first stop was the dark forest in France. You remember that place?
Yes, it's beautiful, but somewhat eerie, at least at night. What happened there?
It wasn't exactly a delightful experience. As I camped there one night, I woke up to find myself surrounded by glowing eyes in the dark. It seemed as if they were staring at me and barely moving. My pulse was racing, and I got a shiver down my spine.
Oh no. Were they hostile? Did you have to fight them off?
No, being scientifically inclined, I realized that my imagination was only playing tricks on me. You know how it is. When you walk through the woods at night, you suddenly see all sorts of things. Nevertheless, the eyes remained and continued to stare at me. Suddenly, I heard rustling in the leaves, and one of the pairs of eyes slowly moved towards me.
Oh my God, I would have a crisis with that scenario. Did you run away, or did you film it with an inferior camera quality and a totally shaky camera feed? Because we all know that's the only way to capture ghosts.
Not at all. Turns out it was just Master Chief and Shadow playing a prank on me. They'd sneaked away from Memmerfield and joined the fun in France, bringing Echo along, too.
That sounds like something they'd do. Pretty nasty, to be honest. But why did you stay there for such a long time?
I wanted to explore its depths for scientific purposes, You know how much I love geology, Seymour. The dark forest has a unique ecosystem, and I was eager to learn more about it.
That's amazing, Chalmers. Did you find anything interesting?
Oh, yes. I discovered a new type of fossilized rock formation that could rewrite the region's geologic history. I sent samples back to Memmerfield University for further study.
That's incredible. I'm so glad you decided to share this experience with our listeners today.
Thank you, Skinner. But let me tell you about another interesting encounter I had during my travels.
Oh, do tell.
Before I took the flight to France one day, I was hiking up one of the mountains around Memmerfield. You know those hikes can be quite challenging.
Yes, they're tough but rewarding. So what happened?
As I was taking a break, I noticed something peculiar. There was this odd footprint in the mud, unlike any animal from our region.
What creature could it have been? Did you take pictures?
Unfortunately, no. By the time I realized what I was looking at, it had started raining heavily, washing away the prints.
Oh, that's a shame. So we'll never know.
Not quite. Not quite. When I returned to Memmerfield, Sonic and Shadow mentioned they'd seen something strange, too. A mysterious figure darting through the forest. They described its size and appearance perfectly matching my footprint.
Wow. So there's something new out there.
Exactly. It seems we have an unknown creature roaming our forests. I'm determined to find out what it is on my next adventure.
Speaking of adventures, remember that time when Cosmo dug up a hidden door in the garden?
Oh boy, how could I forget? That was quite the ordeal.
Indeed. It took us hours to calm him down and get him to show us where he found it.
And when we finally did, it led us to that strange underground cavern filled with glowing crystals.
And the crystal skull.
Yes, the very same crystal skull that now sits on our mantelpiece.
I so can't believe we have it. It's like having a piece of history right in our own home.
You seem to like him a lot. After all, he's often enough your excuse for a fire in the kitchen.
True, but enough about that. What did you actually do in France after the dark forest?
So after what felt like an eternity of being crammed in that tiny seat, I finally landed in Paris. Then I visited the dark forest. But oh boy, in general, I tell you, Skinner, there's nothing quite like the feeling of French soil beneath your feet.
Oh, how wonderful it must have been. You were lucky to have had that experience without me around to complain about the cramped conditions.
Well, maybe next time we'll splurge on first class. But at least I was able to strike up a conversation with the lady seated next to me. She turned out to be a wine connoisseur from Bordeaux.
No way. That's quite the coincidence. Did you two exchange tips about your favorite wines?
Indeed, we did. She recommended I visit a little-known vineyard in Burgundy that she swears by. Claim they have the most divine Pinot Noir.
Burgundy, huh? That's quite a way away from Bordeaux, isn't it?
Yes, but as you know, I'm always up for an adventure. So I decided to visit both regions during my stay.
Such dedication to your craft, Chalmers. All in the name of bringing the best wine back home for us to enjoy.
Well, not just any wine. We're talking Yip-Whoop-Whoop-Whoop here, the finest, most tantalizing beverage Memmerfield has ever known.
Oh, the very name sends shivers down my spine. But I digress. So, Chalmers, tell us more about your journey through France's scenic countryside.
It was truly breathtaking. The rolling hills, the vineyards stretching out as far as the eye could see. It reminded me of our own little paradise here in Memmerfield, albeit with a decidedly French flair.
Well, I can just picture it now. The sun setting over the horizon, casting an orange glow upon the lush greenery.
And then there was this one time. Mind you, it wasn't my fault, I swear, when I ended up in the middle of a wine-making competition.
The competition? You mean like those TV shows where people have to taste and guess the difference between two wines?
No, nothing quite that civilized. This was more of an impromptu contest, shall we say?
Do tell.
Well, I had stopped at this charming little bistro for a spot of lunch, and as I was sitting there enjoying my coke au vin, I overheard the patrons complaining about how their local vineyard's wine had been declining in quality lately.
Oh, no. That's terrible. What happened to the poor vineyard?
It seems they'd recently hired a new winemaker who wasn't up to par with the old one, but no one could quite put their finger on what was causing the decline.
So, you decided to help them out, didn't you?
Yeah, well, it seemed like a perfect opportunity for me to flex my wine connoisseur muscles. I offered to help taste and compare their wines from different years to determine if there was indeed a difference.
Wow, Chalmers. You're not just a pretty face after all.
Why, thank you, Skinner. So they brought out a selection of their vintages, bottles dating back a few years, and I have to admit I felt like a judge at some kind of rural high-stakes wine pageant.
Did they give you a sash and a crown too? Mr. Napa Valley 2024?
If only, although I did get a nice chief platter. Anyway, I took a sip of each wine, making all the obligatory swirling and sniffing noises, and let them hang on my every word. I could feel their hopes riding on my palate like some sort of bizarre wine-based reality show.
Next on America's Next Top Sommelier, will Chalmers crack under the pressure? Or will he rise to the occasion armed with nothing but a discerning tongue and a sharp wit?
I could practically hear the dramatic music swelling in the background. After some deliberation and a little stalling for effect, I gave them my verdict. The newer wines had an unmistakable hint of, how shall I put this delicately, fermented cardboard.
Yikes. Fermented cardboard, you say? He must have crushed their dreams like a grape underfoot.
It wasn't easy, Skinner. The look on their faces was like I'd just told them their beloved vineyard was built on an ancient burial ground. But then one of the old-timers spoke up and said, I knew it. Ever since they switched to that new cork supplier, the taste has been off.
The Corks. Always the Corks.
Exactly, so I suggested they try a different supplier for their next batch. They were so relieved they offered me a complimentary case of wine as a thank you.
Well, aren't you the hero of the hour? Solving vineyard mysteries and scoring free wine. I bet you're insufferable at parties now.
Only when someone dares to bring boxed wine, Skinner. You know me? I like to keep my standards high, my wine glasses higher. So after my little wine tasting adventure, I finally made my way to the main attraction, the very reason I had embarked on this trip in the first place. The vineyard where they produce our beloved Yip. Yip-Whoop-Whoop.
The Yip-Yip-Whoop-Whoop. The nectar of the gods themselves? Did you finally uncover the secret behind that mystical name?
The name. I did ask about that. Turns out it's a bit of an in-joke among the winemakers. The original owner had a pair of particularly loud geese, hence the yip, yip, and the whoop. Whoop was their idea of the sound made when a cork pops out of a bottle after a particularly good vintage. So it's a combination of vineyard life and celebration, all wrapped up in a name that's as quirky as the wine is exquisite.
Who would have guessed? I always thought it was some ancient phrase passed down through generations of wine growers. The geese make it even better.
It does add a certain charm, doesn't it? Anyway, as I arrived at the vineyard, I was struck by the sheer beauty of the place. Rows upon rows upon rows of vines stretching out as far as the eye could see, with the sun dipping low on the horizon, casting a golden hue over everything. It was the kind of scene that makes you want to give up city life and start wearing straw hats unironically.
Careful, Chalmers. Next thing we know, you'll be trading in your briefcase for a tractor.
Don't tempt me. They welcomed me warmly and introduced me to the head wine grower, a grizzled yet genial fellow named Pierre. He's been with the vineyard for over 30 years and knows those vines better than some people know their own children.
Did Pierre reveal any ancient wine secrets? Perhaps the elusive art of getting the grapes to gossip about their neighbors?
If only, though he did let me in on a few interesting tidbits. For one, the soil in their vineyard is particularly rich in minerals, which they believe gives Yip, Whoop, 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 Whoop its unique flavor profile. And get this, they play classical music to the vines during the growing season.
Classical music? What? Are they trying to cultivate a crop of cultured grapes?
Apparently, it's all about the vibrations. They swear by it, claim it makes the grapes grow plumper and sweeter. I even got to witness it firsthand. Rows of vines swaying gently to the sounds of Mozart. It was like a concert for an audience that never claps, but they certainly do grow.
Well, if it works for them, who are we to argue? Maybe that's why Yip, Yip, Whoop, Whoop always has that extra ooh.
That's what they say. And of course, they insisted on giving me a full tour of the facilities. I saw everything, from the presses to the barrels to the cellars where they age the wine. And let me tell you, Skinner, the smell in that cellar, it was like walking into heaven after being on a strict diet of stale crackers.
The aroma of fine wine aging to perfection. It's almost enough to make a grown man cry.
I was holding back tears myself. They also showed me their range of non-alcoholic wines, which they're quite proud of. Apparently, there's a growing market for it, and they've perfected a method that retains all the flavor without the alcohol. I sampled a few, and I have to admit they were surprisingly good. Still, nothing quite compares to the real thing.
Non-alcoholic Yip-Yip-Whoop-Whoop. I never thought I'd see the day, but then again, I suppose it's good to have options. Did you bring back any of that for the faculty?
I might have slipped a few bottles into my suitcase. It's perfect for those long staff meetings where you need the taste of wine without the consequences.
I'll bet the teachers will appreciate that.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Just as I was finishing up my tour, who do I run into but a rather unlikely trio? Master Chief, Shadow, and Echo. They were also in France on some kind of covert mission. Don't ask me how or why they ended up at the vineyard, but there they were, looking as out of place as a cat at a dog show.
No way. The last people I'd expect to see sipping on fine wine in the French countryside, what did they have to say for themselves?
Well, they didn't exactly come for the wine. Turns out their mission had brought them close to the dark forest nearby, and they decided to take a brief detour, something about reconnaissance, though I think they were just looking for a bit of peace and quiet after who knows what kind of chaos.
I can picture it now. Master Chief with a glass of Pinot Noir, Echo discussing the finer points of vintage with Pierre, and Shadow brooding in the corner, swirling his wine like it's some kind of dark elixir.
You're not far off. Master Chief was surprisingly interested in the non-alcoholic wines. Something about needing to stay sharp. And Echo actually did end up having a long conversation with Pierre about the intricacies of wine production. Shadow, on the other hand, seemed more interested in the shadows cast by the cellar's dim lighting than the wine itself. But they all appreciated the break, I think.
That must have been a sight. Did they leave with a few bottles as well?
I may have convinced Pierre to part with a special bottle for each of them. Echo got a rich, aged red. Master Chief opted for the non-alcoholic. And as for Shadow, well, he took a bottle of the darkest wine they had, muttering something about it being close enough.
I love it. And here I thought your trip was just going to be a simple wine tasting tour. Instead, you've turned it into an epic adventure.
It was quite the experience, Skinner. And to top it all off, we all ended up sitting under the stars, enjoying the wine, or in Master Chief's case, pretending to enjoy it, and swapping stories. Who would have thought a simple vineyard visit could turn into a gathering of the most unlikely group of wine enthusiasts?
It just goes to show, Chalmers, you never know where the road will take you or who you'll run into along the way.
And isn't that the truth? So next time we open a bottle of Yip-Whoop-Whoop, we'll have a few extra stories to share along with it.
Here's to that, Chalmers. To good wine, unexpected friendships, and the adventures we never saw coming.
Cheers, Skinner. Cheers. You know, Skinner, as much as I love our little corner of the world, those last few days in France with Master Chief Shadow and Echo were something special. It felt like I'd stepped into a strange, wonderful dream, one of those moments you can hardly believe is happening.
I can imagine. So what did you all get up to after your unexpected vineyard soiree?
Well, after our impromptu wine tasting and story swapping session, we decided to make the most of the time we had left. Master Chief, ever the practical one, suggested we do some light reconnaissance in the nearby towns. Now, I'm not entirely sure what kind of recon he was thinking of, but we ended up exploring some quaint little villages that seemed like they hadn't changed in centuries.
I bet that was a change of pace for them. I can't exactly picture Master Chief blending in with the local cafe crowd.
You'd be surprised. The locals were curious, of course. How often do they see a Spartan in full armor casually strolling through a French village? But once they got over the initial shock, they were incredibly welcoming. We even had a little incident where a group of children mistook Shadow for some sort of superhero. They kept asking him to show off his powers.
Well, I bet Shadow loved that. Did he oblige?
At first, he tried to keep his brooding demeanor, but eventually he couldn't resist. He pulled off a few tricks with chaos control, and the kids were absolutely thrilled. You should have seen their faces. It was like Christmas came early.
The mighty Shadow, reduced to a children's entertainer. Now that's something I'd pay to see.
It was a sight to behold. And then there was Echo. She is usually all business, but even she seemed to be enjoying herself. She was fascinated by the local architecture and spent a good chunk of time examining old buildings and chatting with the townsfolk about the history of the place.
I can see that. Echo's always been the curious type, never one to pass up a chance to learn something new. Did she make any discoveries?
Well, she found a little antique shop that she insisted we visit. It was run by this sweet old lady who didn't speak a word of English, but somehow Echo managed to have a full conversation with her. I swear they were like old friends by the end of it. She ended up buying this ancient pocket watch, said it reminded her of simpler times, whatever that means.
A pocket watch, huh? I guess even a futuristic eye has a soft spot for the old-fashioned.
Yeah, apparently so. We also took a day trip to the coast, because what's a visit to France without seeing the sea? The weather was perfect, and we spent the afternoon walking along the cliffs, taking in the view. Master Chief, of course, kept scanning the horizon like he was expecting a Covenant dropship to appear any minute. Shadow was more interested in the solitude. It was probably the most relaxed I've ever seen him.
Sounds like a peaceful way to end the trip. Did you all get a chance to talk about anything deeper? I mean, that's quite the mix of personalities you had there.
You know, we did. On our last night, we found this little tavern near our inn and settled in for a quiet evening. The conversation turned reflective. Maybe it was the wine or the sea air, or just the fact that we knew our time together was coming to an end. We talked about what drives us, the battles we've fought, both literally and metaphorically. Master Chief spoke about his sense of duty and how it defines him, but he admitted that he sometimes wondered what it would be like to live a simpler life. Shadow, in his usual enigmatic way, talked about the search for purpose, how he spent so long trying to find his place in the world. Echo, interestingly enough, brought up the concept of memory and identity, how our experiences shape who we are, and how important it is to remember where we've come from, even as we move forward.
That's surprisingly profound. It sounds like you all found some common ground despite your differences.
We did. It was one of those rare moments where you feel connected to something bigger than yourself. We weren't just a group of oddballs thrown together by circumstance. We were a team, if only for a short while.
And then it was time to head back.
Yes, the next morning we all went our separate ways. They had their own vacation to return to, and I had a flight back to Memafield. We parted on good terms with promises to meet again in holidays, though knowing them, that could be anywhere, from next week to the next millennium. As I boarded my plane, I couldn't help but feel a little wistful. It's not every day you get to experience something so out of the ordinary, but as the plane took off, I realized how much I was looking forward to getting back to the familiar chaos of Memafield. After all, no matter where I go or who I meet, there's no place quite like home.
And I'm sure Memafield missed you too. Chalmers, no, now I'm curious. What's next on your list of unlikely adventures?
Who knows, Skinner? The world's full of surprises, but for now, I'm content to be back where I belong, with a few more stories to tell and a bottle of Yip-Whoop-Whoop tucked away for a rainy day.
Here's to that. Chalmers, 2 more adventures, more stories, and more wine.
Cheers, Skinner. Cheers. Well, Skinner, I think that about wraps up this week's episode of Skinner and Chalmers Weekly Roast. We've traveled through vineyards, met unexpected friends, and even uncovered the origin of the legendary Yip-Whoop-Whoop-Whoop.
That's right, Chalmers. We've had our fill of French adventure, and now it's time to cork it for the week. But don't worry, listeners. We'll be back with more tales, more laughs, and maybe even a few more puns.
Speaking of puns, Skinner, I'd say we've fully made it through another episode without falling into the winding pit of despair.
Oh, that's a good one. And we hope all you listeners out there enjoyed the vintage storytelling as much as we enjoyed serving it up.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this little journey. And remember, whether you're sipping a fine wine or just enjoying a good laugh, life's too short to take too seriously.
And if you've got any wild stories, curious questions, or just want to share your thoughts, feel free to send them our way. We're always up for a good roast.
Here's to our listeners. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, keep your spirits high and your corks popping.
Cheers to that, Chalmers. And cheers to you all. We'll see you next week on Skinner and Chalmers Weekly Roast.